morning, everyone. Welcome to the final day of exhaustion. I want to welcome you here, introduce the panel quickly and get started. Despite what it says on there, I'm not Matt Sigelman. I'm Dan Restuccia, a colleague of his, also from Burning Glass. Matt had to leave, and so I have the privilege of hosting and moderating this awesome panel here, thinking about what are the solutions for the 44 million adults in the workforce who have less than an associate's degree. And I think it's easy in a room like this to lose sight of the actual demographics of the country. Only a third of American workers have a bachelor's degree. So another third, the 44 million on the board here, that have less than an associate's degree. And too often this population gets overlooked in how we think about workforce development, workforce planning, how training resources get allocated. And so what we've done today is put together a panel with four people who individually and organizationally are leading the charge to think about what are solutions that can help engage those 44 million people in upskilling initiatives that increase economic mobility, that decrease the risk that they'll get caught up in changing technology and automation, and generally get out of the kind of marginal economic situation that comes from unstable employment and low-wage jobs. And so we'll dispense with the usual introductions. Everyone here does really good work. They can introduce themselves quickly as they go, and you can see who they are on the board. But let's start out with Michelle. Would love for you to just give us the lay of the land. What is the scope of the problem as you see it? And you just did an amazing report focusing on a handful of on-ramp programs that are helping to engage and upskill workers. And so give us some examples that you're particularly excited about from that.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Weise. I'm with Strada Education Network, and I lead their Institute for the Future of Work. Thank you so much for coming out on the last day. We're happy to see people in the audience. So we did write a report called On-Ramps to Good Jobs. And it's just talking about trying to fuel innovation for what we call the learning ecosystem of the future. And as we talk about sort of the need to reskill and upskill and retool people, especially as we face a more turbulent future of work, we forget that actually we have a huge swath of our population that needs to be just uplifted in order to get to the place where they can ultimately reskill and retool themselves for that future of work. And in this case, what we tried to quantify is this 44 million number of working class adults, which we define as people who have less than an associate degree and are either jobless or earning less than $35,000 as an individual or less than $70,000 to support a family of four. And in order to thrive in this future of work, we need to figure out ways to build their uniquely human skills, so the skills that will help them stay a little bit more resilient and resistant to potential automation in the future so that they can adapt, but also give them some sort of verticality to their sort of T-shaped learner model. If we think about giving them access to technical skill sets, those sorts of human plus technical skills, we try to sort of look at the kinds of on-ramps that were doing this really important work for the most underserved people, the people who needed the most help in launching into promising pathways. And so we took a look at 9 different on-ramps. Some of them were nonprofit, some of them were for-profit. Unfortunately, they're only, as we kind of did this research with our partners at Entangled, we found that we could only kind of identify approximately 65 or so of these on-ramps that are doing this incredible work that looks a whole lot like what we think of as last mile providers. So we think about coding boot camps and how they're trying to reduce education and hiring frictions. They're doing a lot of this important work, but on top of that, they're wrapping around enormous and critical but also high-cost interventions around helping them navigate systems. Some of these folks are on public assistance. Many of them, in fact, are on public assistance. Some of them don't even have high school credentials. Some of them are formerly incarcerated adults. So these are folks who really need a lot of help in just getting to the point where they're ready to learn. So there's a huge amount of wraparound services and then job placement services. These are incredible programs that have demonstrable outcomes that lead to sometimes 90% job attainment rates, doubling, tripling, or quadrupling the incomes of these learners. So we looked at places like Tectonic and JVS and JobTrain and Philadelphia Works, Perscolas, programs that were really attending to this specific population of 44 million adults. And I think the challenge is those 65 or so programs are attending to about 100,000 learners per year, not even close to attending to those 44 million. And so what we tried to do in this report is just sort of feature all the incredible work that's going on and the things that we should be proud of, but then think about what are the opportunities to scale some of these really important programs. Because as we are all at an event like this, 3 times the amount of investment actually goes into supporting services and programs for more well-educated, college pedigreed folks. Even federal funding tends to steer towards the younger college-going student population. And so how do we think about ways in which we can create better business cases for these enormously important programs? That's really what we feel like is the critical first step in building that kind of lifelong learning ecosystem that everyone keeps talking about, but we don't actually have the systems and the infrastructure to support it.
So let me pass that challenge to Maria.
Great, thanks.
Michelle has left 43,900,000 workers who need on-ramps. How should we be thinking about how to scale? And how do we get from the kinds of excellent exemplar programs that are serving hundreds of thousands to programs that serve millions?
No, I think it's a great point. And so hi, I'm Maria Flynn. I'm the CEO of JFF. It's great to see everybody. So we're really looking at how do you scale for impact. And I think that, and this is where I think as a field the discussion really needs to focus, because I completely agree. You have the Perscolases and the Europes and these programs that have wonderful evidence base behind them, right? And they're, frankly, written up in every report probably that you can read about effective workforce development programs, right? And so, to me, in some essence, that's not news, right? It's kind of like, I've been in the workforce field my whole career since 1991 through a couple of recessions, several presidential administrations. I feel like we, as a field, we know inherently what works, both inherently and with strong evidence base. What we have failed at as a field is how to really make any progress around scale, and that is hugely frustrating. I turned 50 yesterday, and as part of turning 50, I have really, decided that, I don't want to leave this field, the same way I found it in 1991, and I hope that that's something that you all can join me on, is how do we really kind of start having a different conversation? And we're trying to do that at JFF in different ways. I see some folks in the audience who are part of our $1 billion wage gain challenge, right? So moonshot initiatives aren't the answer to everything, but they are ways to get people thinking differently about issues. And so with the help of Schmidt Futures, we put out a challenge to entrepreneurs and programs who could think about how could we help 100,000 workers raise their income by $10,000 a year in a 2-year period. Got 90 responses. We had 7 finalists present this week. We picked 2 winners Monday night. We're also thinking about, how can we really bridge these systems of kind of the traditional system players and the technology solutions, because we at JFF believe that, you need the kind of the best of the both worlds. So in that case, we're working through our new affiliate organization called JFF Labs to really start to work directly with mission-aligned entrepreneurs, starting with a work-based learning cohort that Walmart has helped to support, which is fantastic, and really start to look at, how do these new models like Catalyte, like Nepris, like others, how can they really be leveraging, these traditional systems? How can they be focusing their outcomes on harder to serve populations and so on? We're going to be rolling out additional cohorts over the next couple of months. I also think that policy has to be a part of it, even if it's a frustrating environment right now in DC. I know this is something Danielle agrees with me on, is I spent most of my career at the Department of Labor in DC doing policy work, and there really is no policy for low-skill working adults. There just isn't, So if you fall into that population, you're not going to be covered by the workforce, by WIOA. You're not going to be covered by Perkins, So it's like this is a population that is kind of falling into a black hole in that regard. So, I guess to summarize, I think it's like, how do you get the bold ideas out there? How do you get systems and innovators working together in new ways? How can you change the policy discussion? If we just keep scaffolding off of programs that were, initiated during the New Deal, we're not going to be building the workforce of the future that way. So how can we think bigger and bolder around what is the policy infrastructure and the programmatic infrastructure that needs to exist?
So I want to come back to the policy question, and the anxious and impatient person in me says, yes, we need to do that, and that is a long road. In the meantime, I'm going to guess some 30-odd million of the 44 million adults are currently employed. Michelle can correct my numbers if I'm off. But given that many of these workers are currently in the workforce, Leah, would love to have you talk a little bit about what is the role that you're playing at Coursera in empowering and encouraging employers to think about what is it that they can do to upskill their existing workforce? And what's the economic imperative for employers to do that?
Absolutely. So it's good to meet you all. As Dan mentioned, my name is Leah, and I lead the part of Coursera that specifically partners with companies and governments and nonprofits to upskill their organizations. And it's turning out to be a really powerful arm of the organization. So for those of you who don't know, when Coursera launched, it represented a partnership between 150 of the leading universities to make their education globally accessible. And right now there's about 40 million learners that come to Coursera to learn. And for a while there was a thought that this would be a tremendous way to potentially reach populations like this, individuals who would come online to learn. But there are two main problems. One is that the vast majority of people who would come to the platform already have bachelor's degree. And the second is that they would lack the institutional context and the motivation and support to learn. So I think Michelle framed the challenge. You have these big, open, massive platforms that drive learning, and then these smaller organizations that are providing high-touch experiences. So what's happened, though, is over time, Coursera has had a lot of outreach from companies that are very focused now in a rapidly changing economy in transforming their talent and building new skills so that they can actually innovate and survive in companies. And what we've realized is that these institutions are actually vehicles to transform talent, and specifically this population, in new ways. So we're focused on a couple key things. One, when companies come to us, the first question they're always asking is, what does my workforce need to learn? So it's one thing to say we want to help address both their top-tier workers as well as their lower-skilled workers, but figuring out what to learn, what skills, what are the future job openings, that's a massive question. And so what we've done is we've aggregated a lot of the data from this massive learner population to help companies say, these are the trending skills of the future, these are the future jobs that you want to develop in your industries, and these are skill paths that allow you to take a worker who may be in one field, a service line worker at a telecommunications company, a customer support person, and help them get into another field. The second big challenge to tackle is to actually develop that content, and specifically develop content that would allow workers like this to upskill into new areas. And one of the most exciting initiatives that we've worked on is actually in partnership with Grow with Google, where they built an IT professional, they call it the IT professional certificate. And specifically, it's a pathway that allows anyone who has no tech jobs to start learning, and in the end, be eligible to have a true job in IT with a 80,000 plus salary. And so there's been a tremendous experiment going on over the past year in partnership with the JFF to figure out, of all the organizational vehicles that could take this learning and deploy it, what would be the most powerful. So we've released it on our consumer platform. We've partnered with JFF to provide the certificate to community colleges. We've partnered with companies and given it to companies to deploy to their workforce. And the data is just starting to come back. So specifically, the question is, which learners in which of these environments actually proceed through the program and learn? And so far, the biggest finding is actually compared with learners who learn on their own in consumer platform, 60 to 70% of learners who learn in the context of institutions, either in companies or in community colleges or nonprofits, are actually proceeding through the program and completing. So it's a great stat, and I think our challenge is now that we know that the answer is through organizations, and part of our job is to think of all the organizations that we can serve, how do we address people at work? We need to develop more expertise on how to provide this type of support at scale.
Thanks. Danielle, would love to have you share a little bit about what you've done at Walmart to think about questions of upskilling. Walmart clearly is the largest employer in the country, and one that I think has thought about these questions in ways that are probably more sophisticated than anyone else I've seen. And so what are the lessons you've learned from what you've done, and how do those translate to employers that have less scale?
Yeah, sure. Good second question. What a challenge that one will be. So hi, thank you for having me here. Danielle Goonan, I work at Walmart, and I'm on the Walmart Giving team. I do both giving, and I serve as a SME to my HR folks. So actually right now I'm spending 75% of my time on an HR project, which is really exciting because I get the best of both worlds. Walmart comes to this work through the lens of shared value. Many of you probably know that term, but the idea is, how do we have double, triple, quadruple bottom line? So we're benefiting our bottom line as a business, our associates, the communities in which our stores are located, our customers, right? How do you think about that? And we think about that across 3 pillars: community, opportunity, and sustainability. I'm going to focus on the opportunity pillar for today because that's where our learning work sits. Within that, we think of, I would say, we like frameworks. So 3 basic pillars: access, stability, mobility. Access is, does someone have access to a job, and a good job, right? Because retail is a low barrier to access industry, which is great, it's how do we get folks into retail as quickly as possible, get them in a job, and once they're actually in a job, how do you push as much stability and mobility interventions at them so that they could have their best life? So on the stability side of the house, the company has really taken the lead on that, right? Whether it's increasing wages, or it's a new parental leave policy, or it's our MyShare bonuses every quarter, right? There is, okay, how do we make sure that our workers have stability? And then the company has said, okay, Foundation, we need your help in thinking about the mobility piece. So we're going to do a bunch of stuff on the job for our workers: pathways, academies, on-the-job training programs, connecting credit, higher education credit to on-the-job training. And now we have a new lifelong learning program through Guild Education with Brandman Bellevue and the University of Florida. But we need to think about what are the new products and programs that should exist in the market on the mobility side that could benefit the entire retail industry and lift up retail and service sector workers. So within our mobility pillar on the Foundation, we're thinking about new ways of learning, new ways of signaling, and new ways of employer partnering. And going back to exactly what Maria said, our assumption is that there is no real lifelong learning system in this country for frontline service sector workers. I was in the Obama administration before I came to Walmart. I'm obsessed with education and workforce policy. I love to talk about it, so if you want to grab coffee one day and talk to me about it, let's reauthorize WIOA soon, right? But when you look across the titles, when you look at higher education, when you look at Perkins, when you look at there's some money for TANF, there's some money for SNAP ENT, but really you're trying to like fit our working learners into one of these very defined federal or public streams of dollars, and it's not really working. So the way we're thinking about it is, how do we change and augment the current system? No doubt about that. How do we also change the behavior of employers? So how do you actually drive employers to make more investments in their frontline workers? So yes, employers, you have responsibility in this too. And then how do we also support innovations that can be used within the traditional system, or quite frankly, can force the traditional system to change, right? And so when it comes to that learning side of the house, I think you see technology across all of it, right? We need technology for new ways of learning. So we've made investments in products. You need technology for new ways of signaling, right? So how do you use machine learning and artificial intelligence to be able to signal skills needed, skills had, where to get those skills? And employers, for scale, for cost efficiency, for all the things, access, they need to leverage tech products, right? Because when you're talking about, for example, 1.5 million employees, we can't develop a contract with every community college in the country. It is impossible. And for quality purposes, probably not the best way to go. So we use Guild as a way to say, what's the quality assurance? What providers are you bringing us to assess? And now what is the wraparound services you could provide our own employees as they go through their higher education journey? Can you put them in a cohort? Can you put them in, can you give them access to a coach, right? So that they feel like they're part of an institution, even though they're doing this online. And so the next step with the foundation is launching this sort of what I would say collective impact campaign called Digital US, which is really about taking national organizations, some of whom are our grantees, like JFF, and some of whom are not our grantees, to say, how do we, in this changing world of work, figure out how to make sure technology is leveraged for those that we might currently be leaving behind, like service sector workers. And how do we do this by, one, ensuring that there's good digital literacy programs and products out there for these working learners, and how, on the other side, do we make sure that education, adult education, workforce development, and employers have the digital transformation services they need to be able to leverage technology for these populations. And so right now they're getting the collective impact stuff going. They're assessing the gaps that currently exist within this framework, as well as some of the opportunities. And we hope many of you in this room will join us as we figure out how do we really leverage technology to make sure that these workers aren't being left behind.
Thanks. So a couple of the themes that I'm hearing through the conversation. One, as Danielle just articulated, different workers have different length journeys that they need to travel to get from where they are in their home situations and their skills to a stable, viable career. Everyone talked about pathways. And I'm going to get tactical for a minute, because I think all of us in this panel have designed pathway initiatives. Many of us in the room have designed pathway initiatives. And it'll be a little bit controversial, and say I think most pathway initiatives don't work because they tend to be designed by on sort of a theoretical basis. To say people should be able to do this, and then they can enroll in this training, and then they can enroll in that training, and then they'll get this job, and then they'll get that license, and then they'll get that other job over there. And so, yes, there is a pathway, but nobody ever travels down that pathway. And so would love to hear the panel give some thoughts around how do we talk about pathways, and pathways are clearly so important. How do we get from pathways that exist on paper and in grant applications to pathways that people can follow?
I'll start. So I think a couple things. So I think as a field, we've had so much attention on pathways, but a lot of investment around first job, first credential, which is terrific. But that's another place where I feel we can almost check that box, right? I think we know a lot around how to get someone in that first job, that first credential. I think where we completely fall off the cliff is what happens next. So I think that there's, I think this is a role for foundations and others around how do we really look at, what is that next job, that next credential, and what is the realistic pathway that follows. I think there's a report that we put out last year with Burning Glass, actually, where we, I think, analyzed many resumes, a resume data report called When's a Job Just a Job and When Does It Launch a Career? We were able to really categorize jobs into, springboard jobs that did launch a career, kind of, I think we call them lifelong jobs, like dental hygienist, where it's a decent job that you may not advance, but you could still have a family-sustaining wage. And then jobs that we didn't use the term dead-end jobs, but that's kind of what we meant. But really just starting to categorize, like, let's get a little more granular around occupations and what pathways can look like. I think on the employer side, as Danielle said, there's a huge role, I think, for employers around this. And I think ideally, if we could start looking at what is actual advancement data within big companies, to what extent are folks moving up, the ranks, within companies, and then looking at a regional kind of ecosystem level, really start to look at advancement pathways within a region that may be within a company or maybe across companies, and starting to think more about like an advancement ecosystem in that regard.
I think part of this issue, right, is an assessment problem. We are not great at assessing skills and abilities and just sort of knowledge sets. And we also have no way of assessing the kinds of hidden skills that people may have through years of caregiving or other sorts of responsibilities that aren't codified through a credential. And as we think about this particular population, that gap in the marketplace is significant. And that's where like a conference like this is interesting to see where we're moving in that regard. So we can't do great gap analyses of who is this person now, how do we get them to where they want to go. That's one, I think, critical issue. But then the other, as we think about the employer role in this, is so agree with you, Maria, that getting people to that first good job is something that a lot of innovators are working on and a lot of institutions are working on. The challenge that we've noticed in these on-ramps to good jobs is that it's not even enough that you do all these different sorts of services and training programs to get these learners into that first good, or into a great sort of promising job. The potential for churn is huge, just because as these are definitely just a high needs population that has never really had sustained access to economic opportunity. So when they're moving into a Fortune 500 company, which is just a totally different kind of space or whatever the job may be, when they hit a roadblock, if they don't have the same sorts of wraparound supports from the employer, there's just a huge risk of churn from there as well. So the problem here is not even enough to get them into that good first promising pathway. It's how do you keep them there and how do you make sure they can stay there long enough to advance is something that came up through the research.
We've seen a couple bright spots in the way employers are actually taking this on, and the example that actually stands out best to me is at AT&T. So AT&T has rolled out many different learning programs at scale as part of this larger recognition that by mid-2020 and beyond, they predicted that 30% of their workforce would be out of the job. So they essentially committed to reskilling this population, and what they did is they actually said those people who learn and get certificates and proceed through these pathways will be eligible to interview for a job in a new field. And so that's the first step, right? There's many employers out there that they care about their companies. They're saying, how do I encourage people to learn? But to actually go so far and to say, we'll actually interview you for new jobs and we'll commit to hiring you if you do so, that was the first big move that they made. But the second thing is they're starting to get the data on this experiment as well. And what they're finding is that people who reskilled and entered new job pathways were actually more successful in those jobs than the people that moved up the functional paths. And I think about that example a lot because, yes, there are some employers out there who are more benefits and are thinking the way I think Walmart is, but most people are just trying to think about how to get their people to learn. And I think if you can build that challenge, which is something that employers really care about, into a commitment to also proceed and support those who do learn and opening new pathways, that would represent a transformation. And so that's a theme we're trying to echo again when we engage CLOs. The second thing that comes to mind as well is we think a lot about the role of gender in this place, and in particular in this discussion. A stat that always stood out in my mind was that and again, Michelle can correct this out if it's not quite right. But so a little over half of the people in this 44 million bucket are women. But if you look at people making salaries below the $30,000 mark, the number of women actually raises to 83%. And so one thing I've found powerful is that online learning and technology can actually be a particularly powerful way to engage women. And we've come out with a bunch of research and experiments lately, particularly in the technology field. And I'll give you one example. So we did an experiment where we changed the name of the professor on a course. 1 week it was a male professor, the other week's a female professor, and had different learners come to the course. And we found that actually women were 26% more likely to proceed in the course and continue learning when they saw that the teacher was a professor. The professor was a woman. Sorry, long day. That the professor was a woman. And so it's a powerful sign that, particularly when we're taking on this challenge, if we want to engage women, in addition to thinking of the broader challenge of support services and pathways and meaningful inroads, we need to think about who these learners are and how do we actually create systems and technology that are specifically going to address the challenges of women. And I think there's a lot of bright spots there as well for us to think more creatively.
If I could just jump in here really quickly. So I think the easiest way to get people to learn is provide it on the job and pay for them to do it because it's part of your role, right? So that's what we did at Walmart. We started with Pathways, which was everyone who was coming into Walmart within the first few months had to finish this on-the-job frontline training program. When we initially started, it was connected to a wage increase. Then we kept raising our wages, so it wasn't necessarily, and we didn't find a correlation between finishing the program in a short amount of time and wanting that dollar raise, which I think is interesting when we think about what actually incentivizes people to learn. It's not always what we think it is, right? And then when it came to, okay, now you're ready to be a supervisor, whether it's the first level of supervisor or all the way you're now a market manager managing multiple stores, you're going to go through our academy program, which are our Walmart schools. There are 200 of them around the country, right? And again, we are going to pay to send you there. You're going to get your wage, and we're going to pay for your hotel if you have to stay overnight. But that is part of your job, so you're getting paid to learn. And congratulations, you just graduated from Academy. Now you have 6 college credits for this lifelong learning benefit that we'll pay for you to do at Brandman, Bellevue, or the University of Florida. And those are our providers currently, but we hope to add more in June, right? So it's like, how do you encourage learning because it's part of your job, we're paying for it. Now, once we get you really excited and you're like, I could do this. I never walked a graduation stage before, but I just crossed the Academy graduation stage and I'm crying and I can't believe I'm wearing a cap and gown. Wait, now Walmart's going to pay for me to get my high school equivalency degree or to enroll in college. And so we're trying to blend, and it's not easy because there are policy issues that don't make this easy, right? But we're trying to blend the on-the-job training with the lifelong learning benefits to say, how do we encourage through on the job and then say, now look, there are all these other benefits we could offer you and use that as an on-ramp.
One quick thing just to connect Danielle and Leah's points. So Walmart Foundation came out with this incredible report with McKinsey on, thinking through 3,000 counties and how we can kind of break this dichotomy of the urban-rural divide, right? That's actually kind of a false divide. And you came up with like 8 different profiles of different parts of any kind of state. And what's interesting there is we think about the motivations and like what is leading to pathways that actually do work. We can't overlook the regional component of this, because that was another thing that kind of emerged from our research is a lot of these successful on-ramps to good jobs are mostly happening in densely urban areas. Yep. And as they try to move into slightly more rural or distressed Americana kind of areas, they haven't quite figured out how to tackle this challenge. And so that's another like major piece that as we think about ambition and motivation, we haven't figured out.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think part of why scale is so difficult is that, I think a lot of replication studies over the years in this field, have not been successful, right? So how do you, I don't think we haven't really cracked that yet, right? How do you replicate these promising models in different situations, different demographics, different geographical areas? So it's a big challenge.
So I'm wondering if this is a little bit like the Oscars where they're starting the music to tell us to hurry up. The clock here says we have 5 more minutes, so we're going to use it. But Maria, I promise to come back to policy. I'm going to continue to be impatient, because my family tells me I am. And so if we want to move the needle on this 44 million, right, and if we want it to be 39 million, so change the lives of 5 million people in the next 3 years, what's the, and I'm like, now it's like a genie, like we'll rub our little water bottle lamp. And you get one, I want to call it a wish, you get one action, and 1 minute each. What do you do?
What's our time frame?
Change 5 million lives in 3 years.
I would kind of go the route that Danielle has kind of alluded to, is reimagining on-the-job training. If you think about the enormity of dollars going into OTJ and just the L&D side of employers, nobody has transparency or visibility into what those dollars are doing, and often they're kind of shunted towards compliance training versus trying to help our adult learners figure out how to accommodate learning on top of everything else going on in their lives. We're trying to, at this point, tell learners or anyone who's aspiring to advance their careers, do this on top of everything else you've got going on in your lives. And that's just, we have to figure out how we incorporate on-the-job training in a much more deliberate and intentional and productive way, I think.
I think I would sort of push to reimagine tuition reimbursement. There's about $20 billion spent on tuition reimbursement today, and largely it's through government tax credits. And I think there's an opportunity to reframe what employers have to do before they get those tax credits and focus that money on meaningful educational programs and paths that will actually have an impact, versus today it's a real free-for-all with very little strategic direction.
I think I would actually take perhaps a risky bet and try to hop on the opportunity zone bandwagon, you know, and how do you kind of leverage this kind of newfound interest in investing in communities and use that as a leverage point for really looking at the talent infrastructure within those communities.
So one of the greatest unlocks we've seen in our grant work specifically has been on the English language learning side. The quickest sort of promotionability has been unlocking language, at least in service sector employees. And so one of the programs, National Immigration Forum, has a contextualized ESL program for frontline retail workers. They delivered it historically through the non-credit side of a community college with a blended learning model, and now they're moving it more to a 100% digital version, and they're testing which versions work. They also have a corporate trainer version. 40% of folks after each cohort were promoted after 8 to 12 weeks access to English language learning. And I think that actually says something, right? It's that one thing that's holding them back. And we have all of this amazing immigrant talent in this country that if only we were unlocking that language piece, we could see real economic mobility. CELED is another tool where we have seen, they just won the Schmidt Futures Challenge. They are a portfolio company of the Employment Technology Fund. Walmart is one of the original funders of that patient capital fund. What we've seen through testing the tool with World Education, which is here in the room today, is that it unlocked wage increases for frontline healthcare workers, right? Because they needed frontline healthcare workers who could speak English to their clients, right? It makes a ton of sense, and employers are willing to pay for that, especially in a tight labor market. So when you talk about federal dollars or state dollars for English language learners, I mean, you're looking at Title II of WIOA, which is, what, $500 million a year, right? Across 50 states. I mean, it's pathetic. So I would love to see, like, what are some quick wins we could actually really dive into and push.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking Michelle, Leah, Maria, and Danielle. I think the problem is big, but lots of exciting opportunities to chip away at it. So thank you all for coming.